complicated topics. Unfortunately, in life, we often get stuck at the dichotomy representation, and inevitably that oversimplifies things. So, for example, I do think that we consider the act of world building as one of its forms that it can take is this, creation of worlds to imagine what alternatives may be. The thing is, as geographers, we'll tell you that, you can't ever fully bound something. Like boundaries are inevitably going to be leaky or porous. And so I think the same thing kind of goes with, creating a world, as a quote unquote sandbox, because part of our intervention is saying that this world never just exists out there in a vacuum as kind of this thing that you can go play with, and then it's not going to have any other, things aren't going to impact it, or it's not going to impact us. Because of course, just the fact that we might be interacting with it in some way may end up shaping our behavior, or, our interactions with it shape this universe in certain ways. I mentioned sci-fi before, and I think this is just a really clear example of one of the ways in which world building has been and continues to be used as this kind of sandbox approach of saying, okay, we're in this period of immense change, not just ecologically, but also socially. And being able to imagine what a world might look like that has been impacted by climate change and how life may be able to continue to go on, I think is a really excellent illustration of that. One example I think of, I mentioned Octavia Butler earlier, but the film Beasts of the Southern Wild, I love that film. And I think it is just such a beautiful illustration of the ways that communities can continue to demonstrate so much strength and resilience. And specifically in this film, it is a Black coastal community. Given the fact that this movie came out around, I think was it in 2000? It was shortly after Katrina, I think. I don't remember the exact year. But to me, at least, it was very clear that Katrina influenced the production of this film. And you have this walled off city that they don't ever really obviously lay this out, but it seems like it's mostly white people that live in the city. And then you have these extremely poor, much more racially and ethnically diverse communities that are making a living out in this flooded, almost wasteland. And so I think of that as kind of another example where you kind of see the integration of not just what the ecological or physical geographical impacts of climate change might be on a landscape, but you also see how these communities kind of grow up and adapt to this new normal. And it's this, imagination of what that could look like.
Sorry about that. That was my dog barking. This is the trouble of home offices amid pandemic. I think the sort of, how did you put it? The playing with what ifs or alternatives, right? One person, I don't know this person, but we loved their piece, Leah Zaidi, I believe is how you might pronounce that we quoted in our piece. They write that, quote, because narratives are processed differently than other forms of information, leveraging storytelling and world building may allow us to challenge societal values without antagonizing protected values, which they refer to as kind of these kind of deep held questions. And I think in these times, when we're talking about political polarization in our country and around the world, and really these kind of deep conflicts, some of what I work on, my main research for my dissertation was on gray wolf conflict in the Intermountain West, right? A very polarizing and conflictual issue. I also work on questions of public lands grazing and a lot of these sort of contentious socio-environmental questions. And that idea of, is there a way we can maybe play with alternatives or get people that disagree on a lot of stuff and talk about possibilities together? I think, there's work within the social sciences, and certainly, we can think about world building in these terms as a space to use narrative and story to do real social, political kind of work. I think there's some really interesting and exciting potential there that kind of bridges what has been sort of a passion project and some of the main thrusts of my research.
I really want to get to that last bit there, where you talk about bridging the work between your work and world building, storytelling, myth making approach. But before we get there, I just want to go back to this question of expanding our implicit understandings through the sandbox idea. And I want, ideally, if either of you can talk about how that relates into treating the other in our society, treating people who have been marginalized or otherized. How can we conceptualize using this sandbox approach to expand the way that we consider people who are at the margins of society?
So, one of the things I think that has been a draw for science fiction and fantasy, speculative fiction broadly, for many peoples historically, right, is this idea of exploring worlds otherwise. And we talked about how potential alternative futures, we've talked about the idea of like opening up to other creators, other storytellers. But, science fiction has also been a place for a long time of exploring the alien, the using sometimes ham-fistedly and problematically, but using alternate worlds, alternate futures as a place to explore questions of race, questions of gender, questions of being an alien, right, in a national border kind of sense. We've seen work, thinking about non-human entities and ethics in sci-fi, right? So I think there's a lot of exciting potential there for considering the other, right? Othering as a sort of process.
I think a really great paper that thinks about this is one of the papers that's in our special issue by Hannah Gunderman, who her research looks at geographies of fandoms and focuses specifically on Doctor Who. And so her paper asks whether watching Doctor Who actually contains within it the potential to help create a more peaceful and just world. And through examples exactly like what Jeff was just stating, using aliens and non-humans through the Doctor's adventures, these people that she encounters, to think about not just the processes of othering, but its impacts and how we can address those to create a more just world. I think that science fiction and fantasy and speculative media in general has long been used as a lens to think about a lot of these questions. You can find so many analyses that are out there, about thinking about zombies as representations of immigrants, or, thinking about, for example, Godzilla, and reading or watching that film in the context of nuclearization and war. I think that I keep coming back to this, but it is a bit of a dichotomy. It's not to oversimplify again, but there's progressive potential at the same time that there's the potential to be significantly less than progressive. And, if you go back and read, Piers Anthony from the 70s, thinking about other older canon epic fantasy where Jeff mentioned earlier, you might have examples of quote unquote other countries or other societies that the hero encounters, and they're very obviously based on some racialized group in the world, and it's just like a very thinly disguised representation. I'm thinking here of Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, where it's clearly supposed to be like the Mongol horde drinking their fermented mare's milk and riding around on the plains or the steppes of Central Asia. It couldn't be more obvious what that is referring to. And one of the things that I think is interesting about especially the first book is if you look at the map that's in the front of that book, that country, that land isn't even represented. It is literally off the map. They only show the part of the map that is Westeros, or, it's basically like the UK. And I will say that George R.R. Martin has been very clear that he deliberately wrote the book as kind of a fantasy take on the War of the Roses. So it does sort of make sense that maybe he would have those ancillaries. But when I think of Robert Jordan as another example, it's very obvious when you read his book, oh, this is supposed to be Japan, and this is supposed to be the Caribbean. And And it also can, kind of sometimes edge into the environmental determinism where you're like, really everyone from this land is like behaves this way because, it's cold or it's hot or something like that. This is why at the end of the day, I think it is so important to, again, reiterate the need to, make sure that we are considering whose voices are telling these stories and whose stories are being told. That's not to say that, someone who's been racialized as white can't very sensitively and critically, reflexively tell the story, someone who has been minoritized or othered. But that is not an undertaking that should be tossed around and like without a great deal of thought and preferably a lot of insight from people who have different experiences and positionalities in the world than you do.
I just wanted to add a little thing to that about Lord of the Rings. And, we started picking up on themes of race and racialization in Lord of the Rings, which is written by this guy who lived through World War I and had a lot of complex emotions about war and the Ottoman Empire and a lot of things. But, one of the things that's been on Twitter, I think in the last year or two really peaked was discussions of the orc, right? The figure of orcs and this sort of completely dehumanized evil kind of race and kind of what work that does and how is our ideas of orcs redeemable? Can we reconfigure that into something like Dungeons and Dragons, or is this inherently a kind of regressive, racist, really, position within the kind of canon of fantasy? We don't have to explore that. I have complex thoughts on it, but it is an interesting question in which ideas of race and othering are playing out in current dialogue around fantasy world.
Just one more, also not just thinking about how our own ideologies and the ways that we perhaps unthinkingly end up mapping some of our existing categories of, say, race or gender or sexuality onto fantasy races, for example. But also, I think that is an interesting question to examine when you look at some of the reactive pushback against things like having a female doctor, or could Hermione be Black? Or, is Spider-Man allowed to be Hispanic, or things like that, and where you get these communities that just express outrage, like, how dare you? No, canon, Peter Parker is supposed to be white, things like that. So I think, again, there's a lot to be said there, and that might be a conversation to have another time, but I did want to just gesture to that really quickly.
No, that's a really important point. And if we had more time, I would absolutely go deep down that rabbit hole. But I want to go back to something Jeff said a little earlier. And broadly, I want to talk about what is the role of story and myth in our contemporary politics, in the way in which we think about sometimes tractable, sometimes intractable issues.
This is something I'm continuing to grapple with in my own research and in my own political thinking. I think story is a huge part. There's been some great research out there from social scientists and humanities folks about the role of story in a narrative, right? Whatever combination of things we want to use to refer to this, but story generally in the way our brains are wired because of evolution, right? We're storying kind of creatures, but also, yeah, absolutely, the way they play a role in politics. I've played around a little bit in some of my writing and thinking about kind of story and metaphor and scientific theory, even, as lenses through which we interpret the world, and then the way in which these stories also provide guides to action. They set up certain relationships between things and people. They tell you what is good and what is bad and what you should do. And so having good or alternative or better stories is a very important, I think, political project and an intervention we need to be making. And challenging stories that reinscribe oppression and inequality is an important thing to be doing, maybe across spheres, in fiction, in politics, in our research as, social scientists, scholars.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the process of doing research and writing up research, that is telling a story, right? But we are constantly told and through our research reproducing stories. And, one example is just Western knowledge itself, this idea, the positivist idea of knowledge